I won't. I won't sweep the floor. It is beneath my dignity. Anytime, anywhere, you could wake me up in the middle of the night and I could recite that to you. The opening lines of Tick-Tock of Oz, always my favorite Oz story. I don't know if it was Tick-Tock's anthropomorphic charm or the dragon's detached wisdom or that Betsy Bobbin was from Oklahoma, but Tick-Tock stood out for me from all the other books that I read. Although it seems like Oz stories didn't concern themselves much with politics except to poke fun at officialdom, there was one passage in Tick-Tock that chilled me the first time I read it and gave me pause every time that I read it, many times after that. It's the long-eared hearer in the Gnome King's throne room, and he reports, "There's a war." "Pah," says Ruggedo, "there's always a war. What else?" Ruggedo's dismissal seemed a tight frame around the human condition, seen from a safe distance. When I wrote the story, It's Tuesday, This Must Be Oz, in 1972, it was a very unsettled time in American history and in my life, even though the turbulence of the 60s had ebbed a bit. The war in Vietnam was still raging. There was a threat of terrorism. I saw the Guardia Civil in the Madrid airport that summer with automatic weapons clutched to their chests. And the culture wars between generations and religions and races and classes were seething. I wanted, I think, without really understanding this at the time, to travel to Oz and look at my times from that distant, unaffected point of view. Chapter 1, Subway to Oz. It was very early morning, and the subway was not too crowded. Portia and Bubba were sitting in the second row of car number 27. Portia was asleep, his battered tennis shoes hanging limply over the seat in front of him. The car swayed a little, and his big cowboy hat slid from his head, revealing dirty blonde hair and a scraggly mustache. Bubba smiled, placed the hat gently back on his friend's head, and continued to comb his afro in the dim, frowning reflection in the window. Several seats back and on the other side, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Withers III tried not to notice the two less than respectable creatures in front of them. Mrs. Withers gave a tight little smothered cough into a monogrammed handkerchief. Mr. Withers, who had been in a frightful mood since the couple had left the theater, finally spoke. The roles would break down now, when the only way home is the confounded subway. Mrs. Withers glanced at the two hippies and gave a small whimper of dismay. Her husband humphed softly to himself and jammed his chin into his neck as he straightened his necktie. In the last seat, on the side of the two young hippies, Dora Fuson shook herself out of her dim-eyed reverie. She often drifted into these daydreams to escape the harshness of the typing pool and the boredom of her everyday life. Now her eyes were heavy with sleep and her head seemed to be floating away from her body somehow. She yawned and tried to concentrate on the reflections that stared back at her, but they only seemed to lull her into deeper daydreams. The passages of the Gnome Kingdom are many and extensive, and they reach many distant parts of the earth. One of these tunnels opened in the New York subway system, near the East River switch point. This switch point was one of the busiest. Hundreds of trains sped past each day, but no one knew the cavern was there. And the subway was all computerized, and computers can miss anyway. Somehow, car number 27 was separated from the rest of the train and sped down the Gnome King's tunnel. The cabin gave a lurch. Portia slammed against Bubba, awoke and swore. Mr. Withers threw his arms around Mrs. Withers and they both fell into an undignified heap in the aisle. Dora was brought rudely back to reality by a painful bump on the head. But the coach slowed a bit, took a few gentler twists and turns. The passengers recovered. "Pretty lousy turn," said Portia gruffly as he turned over and began to fall back to sleep. "We'll get off at the next stop and walk," said Mr. Withers. The couple climbed back into their seats. "Oh, dear me," said Mrs. Withers weakly. And the Gnome King's own tunnel carried them safely beneath the sands of the deadly desert to the land of Oz.
Hi, everyone. This is Eric Gjovaag. I am a longtime Oz fan. I've been a member of the International Wizard of Oz Club for over 40 years now. I've been a reader of Oziana since almost the beginning. Besides, of course, all that, I have co-written Queen Anne in Oz with my friend Carol Carlson. I maintain the wonderful Wizard of Oz website at thewizardofoz.info. And I won the 2013 L. Frank Baum Memorial Award. So I feel like I am well qualified to do this, but especially I just finished on my blog reading every issue of Oziana and commenting on the stories. So I'm really, really happy to be able to present to you the second part of It's Tuesday, This Must Be Oz by Mary Reynolds. So I'm going to start with chapter 2, Curious Yellow. In the watch station on the border of Winky Country, the warning bell rang and shouted until she was about to fall off the wall. "Wake up, Perk! Wake up!" The little yellow man rubbed his eyes in his fiercely yellow beard and looked up at the bell. "What's up?" he asked. But the bell could not answer, for her frantic shouting had brought on a fit of sneezing. She pointed excitedly with her clapper towards the tunnel. "Bless you," said Perk, as he pointed his magic spyglass down the tunnel. He watched as the car zigzagged towards him through the tunnel. "I think it's one of ours. Manhattan. That's in Gillikin Land, isn't it, Belle?" But Belle the Bell could not sneeze in response. "Bless you," could only sneeze in response. "Bless you," repeated Perk, as he switched the oncoming car to the track that led to the purple country. The unknowing travelers felt easier as the car stopped swaying so much. Bubba looked at the scenery. Scenery? He turned and looked wildly at Portia, who was asleep. The wizards looked stoically straight ahead, and the girl was asleep too. Bubba prodded his companion. "Look," he said, "no subway, no city, my God. Fields, farms, trees, and every bit of it is yellow." Bubba pressed his nose to the glass in amazement. Portia just turned over. "That's curious," he said sleepily. "Oh ho, funny, but I'm telling you." Bubba just gaped. How could he get Portia to believe that if he didn't believe it himself? But here it was, now everything was as purple as a grape Tootsie Roll pop in the light of the growing Gillikin dawn. "It's purple now," he said finally. Portia realized it was no use trying to sleep. He pushed back his hat, folded his hands on his lap, and sighed. "Smog," he suggested. "Or maybe somebody put something in your spaghetti. Or maybe, look, look, look. All I ask is you look. That's all. Just look." The other passengers glanced outside by pure reflex. 4 jaws dropped as one. Bubba sat back with a satisfied smile as they stared at the purple grass, trees, and quaint purple houses that sped past. Soon the car slowed as it approached a bustling Gillikin town. Portia clutched Bubba's arm and looked pleadingly up into his eyes. "Smog?" The wizards, hearing Portia's suggestion, smiled knowingly. The car halted at a purple train station. Bubba glanced out at the queer crowd and back at Portia. Not Smog. The wizards replaced their respective spectacles, rose, and exited through the back door. "Flashback," Portia said, biting his fingernail. "Both of us at once?" At this point, a stunningly purple Gillikin man popped in the front door. Bubba went through the window with a crash. Portia stumbled out of his seat and scrambled for the back door. Hasty folks, said the purple man. He walked back to Dora's seat and bowed politely. By now the girl had decided that the whole affair was an elaborate daydream. She stood and took the offered arm of the smiling purple man. Thank you, she said. It was a rough trip. Chapter 3. Purple Power. Bubba's sudden crash through the window had sent the crowd of purple people scurrying into their houses. He carefully raised himself on his elbows, avoiding the broken glass, then laboriously got to his feet. Dusting his fluffy hair absently, he stared at his surroundings. A small Gilligan village of about 50 persons, judging by the number of houses. Busy a few minutes ago, but now deserted by his untimely entrance. Behind it, darkening the purple hills, rose a purple forest. Bubba felt a tingling deep inside that seemed to say, "Go to that forest." His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of running feet. It was Portia coming from the back of the car. Bubba signaled to him to follow and began running towards the forest. Portia caught up with him. "Where are we going?" he gasped. "That woods," Bubba pointed. "Are you spaced out?" Portia said, as he stopped running. Bubba stopped, turned and looked at him. Portia tore off his hat and threw it on the purple grass. He put his hands on his hips and stared at Bubba. "We go through outer space and land in purple land, and immediately you want to go traipsing off into some forest? You better hit the town and meet the purple people. I'd rather meet them than a purple cow. They'd probably pen you up with one the way you bellow, 'Come on!'" "Let's walk then," Portia said weakly, picking up his hat. The grass grew taller as the two climbed the hill. Finally, they stood beneath the eaves of the wood. Bubba hesitated. "Mighty mean looking," he said. Portia folded his arms and leaned against an outlying tree. "Most purple forests are," he said cynically. "Pardon me," said a voice, "but you are leaning on my tree." Portia stood up, lifted his eyebrows. "What? Where is it?" Bubba looked round. "Ahem," came the voice from below. The creature stood out against the purple path because it was bright blue with deep red eyes. It was about 6 inches long and covered with long spines and made it look three times its size and were tipped in red. Bubba pointed at it. "That porcupine," he said. "I am not a porcupine. I'm a hedgehog. The hedgehog. Curator of this wood. That is my tree, and before you lean on it, I would like to know who you are." "Portia," Bubba pointed out obediently. "Bubba," he pointed to himself. "Do you realize where you are?" said the hedgehog in a little haughtily. "That's exactly what we're trying to figure out," said Portia in an annoyed tone. "Suppose you tell us, Porky." "Oh, cool it," said Bubba. The hedgehog retorted in a hurt but angry voice. "I think you should have a little more respect for me. I'm the hedgehog, curator—" "Pack it, Prickles," said Portia rudely. The hedgehog gaped, wide-eyed. "Portia," said Bubba scoldingly, "you have to understand," he said to the curator. "He's not too bright, and easily angered." "Not too bright? What the—" "Will you please shut up?" Bubba pleaded. Portia scowled. "I'm sure I can handle him," Bubba glanced sidelong at Portia. "If you would just let us take a walk in your forest. I really like this forest." Bubba clasped his hands and tried his best to look Pacif. And there's a footnote here that says Pacif is a new word, means to. It's a form of pacify or pacific. The hedgehog scratched his chin with a clawed paw. Well, a short one, perhaps. You can follow me." Bubba waved Portia to follow the blue animal, and the pair plunged into the purple forest twilight. Portia walked with his hands shoved deep into his front pockets and a blank look on his face. Bubba looked from side to side and occasionally moved branches to accommodate his height. They walked on all day, following a winding path that made the forest seem much more vast than it really was. Bubba was delighted. Portia seemed more and more bored. It grew dark. The hedgehog's nose began to grow blue. The two followers could see nothing but the blue light, but since the path seemed to be very clear, they did not stumble. Soon the hedgehog stopped and turned to them, looking up at them with his glowing red eyes and blue nose. I'll take you two to a town, he said, where you'll find quick transportation to the Emerald City. The people there, the where? Said Bubba. The where what? The where what? Retorted the hedgehog. What city? Asked Portia. The Emerald City. Why are we going to the Emerald City? You are mortals, aren't you? Well, yes, Portia admitted. All mortals who come to Oz must be brought to the Emerald City. It's the law. Whoa, said Bubba. Come to where? Oz. Bubba sat down quickly, clamping his jaws shut to keep from gaping. Portia rubbed his left eye and grimaced as he always did in such difficult situations. Oz, 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 Bubba repeated distantly. Well, are you coming or not? Snapped the hedgehog. Bubba got up slowly. The hippies followed the hedgehog, now both with hands shoved in pockets and blank looks. The hedgehog continued talking. They don't like Tottenhots in this town. Don't know why. You seem all right to me, but they don't like 'em. What is a Tottenhot? Asked Bubba. You're a Tottenhot, aren't you? I don't think so. Maybe not. Tottenhots are smaller, I believe. The creature glanced back at Bubba's tall form. Portia and Bubba sullenly followed the nose as it chattered and stamped to itself. The forest began to thin, and chinks of bright moonlight illuminated the purple surroundings. It was the kind of moonlight that made you lose track of reality. Here's the edge, announced the hedgehog. They looked out from the forest wall. The Gillikin city was down in the moonlit valley, down a steep hill from where they were standing. You guys will have to watch the pigots now. What are pigots? Asked Bubba. Who cares? Snapped Portia. All right, let's go. So long, Monsieur Hedgehog, said Bubba. They descended the hill and reached a small garden at the edge of town. Are you quite finished with your forest now? Portia muttered. Bubba grinned shamelessly. I wasn't really thinking much about it. How often do you find out you're in Oz? Portia could not help a grin. There, upright on a bench, they slept the rest of the night away, oblivious to the glorious march of the full moon. Bubba was rudely awakened by a pain in his stomach, inflicted by a stick wielded by a pair of purple hands, which belonged to a purple face, which was even more purple with rags. Quickly, he gave Portia a tug on the ear and received a painful rap on the wrist from another Gillikin with a stick before he could jerk his hand back. Portia opened his eyes and froze. How dare you show your face in Picketville, said the first Gillikin nastily, prodding painfully into Bubba's vitals with his stick. We've told you Tottenhots to stay out of this territory. You've got your place and we've got ours. It's just that ours happens to be better. All of Oz here, and we pick the establishment creeps, grumbled Portia to Bubba. His remark was rewarded with a sharp blow on the head. There was yet another surly Gillikin behind the bench. Several Gillikins wandered out of the first houses on the street and ran towards the bench. The chief, still not pulling the stick from Bubba's ribs, turned to address them. I'm glad you came out, because we're going to transport these two ingrates to the mines, he said haughtily. Form a column! The Gillikins lined up quickly. You stand up! Bubba stood up. The shadow of his 7-foot form darkened the Gillikins, and suddenly they were gone. Several doors slammed up the street. Portia stood also, stepping toward his friend. Creeps, he said. Creeps in Oz. There aren't supposed to be creeps in Oz. Let's get out of here. Bubba rubbed his stomach where the stick had been. But we have to find a way to get to the Emerald City. Why? Because that's the only way we can get back to New York. Two simultaneous blows from behind knocked them both unconscious. When they awoke, they were firmly tied, flat on their backs, to a cart being rolled down the main street of the Gillikin city by a group of chattering Gillikins. There were bands playing and people shouting, much like any typical fanatical political rally. The parade moved down to a grandstand draped in purple, where there stood a small group of Gillikin dignitaries in purple top hats. The cart stopped before the podium. A very fat Gillikin mounted the speaker's platform. As he did this, the music and shouting stopped. He was evidently a mayor or some other person in authority. He spoke at length about nothing, the crowd cheering after every sentence, and ended by appointing as head of the armed forces and warden of the prisoners the Gillikin who had stuck his stick in Bubba's gut. After a rousing cheer from the crowd, that Gillikin took the stand and promised to uphold the Pigott way of life. He was about to continue when a small purple man was seen hurrying up the approach stair of the grandstand. Stop! Stop! He shouted frantically. Orders from the Emerald City! Word from Ozma! Silence ruled the square as he reached the top and gasped, The prisoners are not from Oz! They are to be taken to the Emerald City! Order of Ozma! The crowd murmured in disbelief, then in anger. We are to conquer the world, shouted the Gillikins. Who is Ozma? She's not purple. Please, Pigots, please, we must play our game diplomatically, shouted the mayor uncomfortably. Don't you see? Ozma is going to honor us and herself sentence the prisoners to labor in our mines. That will give us the honor and the prisoners and will keep Ozma happy until we conquer her. You see? The crowd murmured again in confusion, then burst into shouts of acclaim. They quieted as the mayor spoke again. I, Roadster Dickus, mayor of the Purple Pigots, hereby dismiss the prisoners to the Emerald City and the custody of Ozma of Oz. The crowd went wild for about 5 minutes, then broke up. Near the cart, Truckus, general of the armed forces of the Pigots and leader of the expedition to the Emerald City, was ordering his column for the march. Column arranged, they set out almost immediately for the edge of town and the road of yellow brick. As the two young men looked helplessly up at the sky, they shuddered in fear and anger while the Pigots sang their marching song. Come the day, all colors view, purple as the only hue. If they resist, we beat their spines and send them off to work in the mines. That lousy porcupine, muttered Bubba. Chapter 4. Yellow Brick Roadster. Mrs. Withers took out her parasol and unfolded it. She and her husband, arms locked, crossed the track and walked down the main avenue. The avenue was really a square where people rushed to and fro, very wide and paved with clean purple bricks. In the center was a small splashing fountain, transparent water with maybe just a hint of purple color. Charming, sighed Mrs. Withers. Look, said Mr. Withers, pointing above the cluster of houses. See? His wife gave a little gasp of delight. Rearing above the purple town were the proud towers and battlements of a castle, a yellow castle, appearing in the morning sunlight to hover over the purple roofs of the town against the blue sky. The couple stopped in wide-eyed, smiling admiration. I'll wager, said Mr. Withers, it's a hotel. People are always converting their castles into hotels these days, full of gimmicks and frivolity, but comfortable hotels just the same. Let's find a way to get there, his wife said excitedly. The spacious avenue began to narrow, finally becoming a normal brick street, which, at the edge of town, brought them to another thing which disturbed the overwhelming purpleness of the country, a road paved with yellow bricks. Why, what an innovative notion, remarked Mr. Withers, as they started up the long incline of yellow that ran past the castle. It was a small castle, only 3 turrets, and it seemed to form a triangle between the 3 towers. As they approached, they saw, as if in a pasture in the purple grass, a powerful-looking chrome-plated motorcycle gleaming in the sun. No walk to the castle from this road, remarked Mr. Withers, as they stopped parallel to the great doors of the castle. Quaint, but in questionable taste. The couple plunged into the knee-high purple grass and came to the doors and the motorcycle. That reflects a poor standard of living among these backward people, remarked Mrs. Withers sympathetically. They can't afford cars. Mr. Withers grasped the large knocker and pulled it back. Just as he did, the door opened and the knocker was jerked out of his hand. The Witherses gaped. There stood a man, all covered with metal, who returned their astonished gaze. Mr. Withers recovered first. He led his wife into the castle. The Tin Man retreated, still staring in unbelief. "If you wish to keep your post, doorman, you must arrive earlier," remarked Mr. Withers dryly. The Tin Man's arms dropped to his sides with a clank, and his polished face looked blank. Could you show us to the dining room?" asked Mrs. Withers softly. Suddenly the Tin Man replied. "Guests for breakfast," he exclaimed. "Right this way. Follow me." Amazed by the forward behavior of the tin-covered doorman, the Witherses could only follow him silently as he ambled rhythmically into an adjoining room and to a small square table where he directed them to be seated. They sat silently as he strode out again, calling, "Botch! Botch! Food for 2 people!" "Such behavior," said Mr. Withers. "Oh," gasped Mrs. Withers. Before they could continue, the Tin Man was back with a large tray of sumptuous fare. He spread it quickly about the small table and seated himself on a stool nearby. The Witherses only sat with their mouths open. The Tin Man's smile faded, and he scratched his head with a metallic ring. Mr. Withers suddenly straightened. "This is totally unwarranted. I shall let the management of this hotel know that no matter how innovative the design, service is the most valuable." "Oh, this is no hotel," said the man, smiling. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Nick Chopper, often called the Tin Woodman, Emperor of the Winky Country of Oz." He continued proudly, "This is my castle. I hope you like it." "Oh, my goodness!" exclaimed Mrs. Withers. "We had no idea this was a private castle. We—" "However," cut in her husband, standing, "we are most pleased to have found persons of taste." A polished blush brightened the Tin Woodman's face, as he also stood, taking Mr. Withers' hand and shaking it heartily. "Enchanted, enchanted," said Mr. Withers. The Tin Woodman gave him a weird look, then indicated the rich breakfast. "But won't you sit down and eat a bit?" They passed a while in small talk, both the Witherses becoming obviously more and more confused to find that they were much farther from New York than they expected. But Mr. Withers refused to appear taken aback. "But really, Your Majesty, I think that a man of your position could help us get back to New York. I need to be watching the market tomorrow. Certainly, I can transport you to the capital on my intrepid machine," said the woodman proudly. "You'll have to see Ozma first, of course, and go through the proper channels." "Oh, no problem," said Mr. Withers. "In the capital, we're certain to know someone." The Tin Woodman looked puzzled, but went on. "If you don't mind, we could leave right now." He strode out of the room, and the Wizards found themselves following him in a slight panic. He threw open the doors ahead of them, and they emerged into the sunlight. Barely were they out when the Tin Woodman turned to the castle, shouting up at it, "Pack yourself up, Botch, and make a carry-all for 2." The Wizards watched in total amazement as the castle roof folded in. Then each of the 3 sides of the castle retracted into its respective turret, much like a window shade. These turrets then shrank and folded themselves into a box with 2 cylindrical compartments. The Tin Woodman picked them up and plunged them onto the back of the gleaming motorcycle. They latched themselves firmly on and grew wheels to accommodate. Then, as the Woodman half-hearted incantated the engine into life, a side door opened to reveal plush interior seats. The Witherses mounted them when a stepladder folded down, the door closed, and they were off. Chapter 5. The Charming Purple Prince. "My name is Roy," said the Purple Man, "and I don't mean to brag, but I am the prince of this Gilligan region." "A real prince!" exclaimed Dora as they walked beneath the awning walkway that bordered the great square. "Of what region did you say?" "The 7th Gilligan princedom of Oz," said Roy proudly. "Oz! Really Oz! Oh, what a marvelous dream! I love it! I've read so much about Oz." Yes. We don't have outside visitors often, and very few of them have read Oz books." "Oh, I've read lots. I know all about Oz. This is the North Country, and—" "Before you start," smiled the prince, "do you like horses?" Dora laughed merrily. "Why?" "Well, you see, all mortals who visit Oz must go to the Emerald City. So I thought I'd escort you there, and if we took horses, we'd get there just as fast as walking, and still be able to take the picturesque roads. Not only that, it's great fun. My home It's very modest, you see. Is on the yellow brick road, and I have a stable there for just such an occasion as this. Wonderful, said Dora, totally charmed. So the two rode for a day cross country by cow paths and forest glades, the most beautiful country Dora had ever seen. On the second day they rode to a high hill where Roy said the view was fantastic. And it was. They could see just a hint of green on the horizon where the Emerald City lay, and they could see where the purples changed to the yellow of the Winky country. It reminded Dora of studying a map, and when viewing the country it represented, expecting to see huge dotted lines marking off territories. Only here there was a line. The winding road of yellow brick could be seen coming out of Winky country and into the Gillikin country again. That lovely road seems to go everywhere, said Dora. Roy pointed southeast. It leads from all the countries of Oz to the Emerald City. Over there is the Munchkin country, all in blue. You'd really look down there. Roy pointed again, and Dora could see a group of purple men down on the road. They surrounded a cart on which two people, normal colored people, a black and a white, sat bound hand and foot. The two boys on the subway, whispered Dora. Outraged, shouted Roy. What cruelty! What? Halt! Roy galloped away, leaving Dora very uncomfortable all of a sudden on the hill. Portia glanced over in their direction. Look, it's the girl, he gasped. What a statement, retorted Bubba, annoyed. What girl? The girl who was on the subway, see? What's up? Ah, yes, she's taken up with them purple fascists. What do you mean? Just because these dudes are bigots don't mean all purple dudes are bigots. Sometimes I wonder about you. You may be right. Look, he's coming toward us, and these pigots don't seem to like it. Roy had left his escort behind and was galloping after the column of pigots. Halt! He cried. The pigots obeyed, but filed quickly to the back, the unfriendly parts of their spears pointed at Roy. Stand back, said Truckus. We are following the orders of Ozma. Roy drew himself up. No one can obey the will of Ozma and yet be cruel in the execution of it. I demand that you untie these people and treat them hospitably. You are not prince over Pigotville, Roy. Get out before we stick you like a pincushion. Roy backed his horse a step. You'll hear more of this, he said, galloping back to Dora. Ha! Doubtless, agreed Truckus. Let's get this bunch moving again, he ordered. Follow me quickly, shouted Roy to Dora. We must race ahead of them to the city and warn Ozma. No, thank you, said Dora resolutely. Roy reined his horse violently. No, thank you. I've had quite enough. I'll go back to the real world right now. But you'll have to see Ozma. I don't want to. She gave herself a determined slap on the cheek and closed her eyes. She opened them. Her smile faded. Please, Dora, said Roy. We're wasting precious time. I don't understand, muttered Dora. I know. I'll fall off the horse. When I hit, I'll hit the subway seat. She closed her eyes again. Roy gasped as she slid limply off the horse onto her shoulder. She sat up, looked around her, and screamed and screamed. Roy rode his already nervous horse around her, totally perplexed. Finally, he leaned from the saddle and lifted her up, screaming all the way in front of him on the horse. Then he spurred his mount and they sped across country, Dora screaming, destroying any hope of secrecy. When they arrived in the Emerald City, her hysteria had died to a weak, retreating whimper. The gates opened automatically for the prince. When he reached the palace, he lifted Dora down from the horse and instructed the servants to take her to an apartment. Suddenly she began screaming again, and the servants almost dropped her. Oh, what's the use, Roy sighed. Don't worry, he addressed the servants. He turned and ran up the emerald staircase leading to Ozma's throne room. The great doors opened. Ozma leaned forward in her throne, eagerly awaiting the prince. He bowed. Your Majesty, the pigots have captured 2 mortal visitors and have them tied up on a cart. Ozma sighed in disgust. These pigots have got to be taught a lesson about their bigotry. I've already dispatched a troop of soldiers to meet them. This is the last straw. Magic picture, the pigots and the mortals. The wall facing the throne lit up, focused, adjusted to show a view of the column of pigots. Ozma and Roy watched in earnest. A shining object drove into the picture. Ozma gasped in delight. The Tin Woodman! She reached behind her throne and produced a telephone. Woodman, she ordered, go stop the pigots! Have my soldiers arrest them! She waved away the magic picture and turned to Roy. TW will handle it. How's the girl? Roy's brow wrinkled in worry. Ozma smiled. I think she'll be all right. For 2 days, the Witherses had traveled by motorcycle, enjoying the scenery of Oz, taking the roundabout roads to the Emerald City. Finally, that dazzling spectacle came into view. The woodman guided his powerful machine majestically up the wide avenue that led to the gate. Then he began to slow. There was some sort of argument on the road ahead. One of the small shouting mob, all dressed in green, spotted the woodman's party and came running towards the motorcycle. The woodman stopped and leaped from his motorcycle with his clatter. Your Majesty, gasped the green man, we have orders to escort 2 captives to prison, and the pigots won't turn them over to us. Climb on the handlebar, snapped the emperor. The green man vaulted himself over the wheel and onto the bars. The Tin Woodman, to the dismay of the Witherses, burned a record quarter-mile as well as an ear-splitting stop. Again he leaped off and looked threateningly down at the pigots. Are you questioning the orders of Ozma? The lead pigot began to whine. We don't see how it's any of her affair. These people came around making trouble in our town, and we ought to punish them ourselves. We'll throw them in the Orty mine. Baloney, yelled the Tin Woodman. Everyone in hearing cringed. The pigot slinked out of the way. The woodman gained control of himself. His metal shoulders slumped. He ordered the 2 captives, Bubba and Portia, to be untied and placed in the compartment. It enlarged itself accordingly. He told the other green people to march back to the city, but the first green man climbed back on his handlebars. I didn't mean to be so angry, he said sadly to the green man as he drove toward the city, but those pigots are really hard-headed. The green man nodded. In the car, the Witherses regarded their companions. How dreadfully dreadful, said Mrs. Withers in disgust. It was a long night at the palace. The travelers could not be allowed to wander around wreaking havoc on the Ozfolk, for whom they all had deep suspicion and distrust by now. Thuds could occasionally be heard as Dora tried to awaken from her dream. Although spell was laid quickly on the hippies to make them lose their ability to shout shocking obscenities, they still tried, and phrases such as bobtail nag, ramblin' wreck from Georgia Tech rang from their rooms all night. The Witherses, who were assigned to the same apartment, were relatively quiet. But the palace servants and other palace occupants who had never encountered someone who didn't like Oz before were nervous wrecks. There was not a person in the palace, fairy or mortal, who slept well. But deep beneath them, in the constitution of the land itself, the greatest magic ever was brewing. Chapter 6. Glinda's Riddle. I hate crises, said Dorothy. They disturb everybody so bad. I get on better without them. But Ozma said nothing, only sat majestically on her throne, scepter in her lap, staring straight ahead at the great emerald-studded doors that were due to open and admit the 5 strangers any minute. Dorothy, not wishing to listen to her own talk, fell silent and looked at the floor on which she was sitting cross-legged. The girl ruler sighed and let her scepter fall slowly into a pile of cushions beside the throne. She noticed Dorothy's disappointment. She smiled. I do better without them too, Dorothy, but Ozma was interrupted by the opening of the great doors and Tick-Tock's mechanical announcement. I brought them here as you commanded me, Your Majesty. They didn't give me any trouble. Fine, Tick-Tock, said Ozma quietly. The 5 prisoners formed a semicircle in front of the throne. I've heard all your cases, and they all appear similar to me. In order to decide what is to be done, I have summoned all my most trusted friends to help me. She picked up her scepter and pointed towards the back of the room. There appeared the group of odd characters that make up the powerful Ozian aristocracy. The Wizard, the Tin Woodman, the Scarecrow, the Wogglebug, and Glinda the Good. They all bowed and did homage to their ruler. Ozma began her address. You have all been notified of the proceedings of this high hearing that these people, brought to Oz by a freak accident, wish to go home, not because of concern for their friends or their loved ones or their baseball team, but because they dislike, even despise, this fairy land of Oz. After a pause, she began again. So now I ask you to say what you think we should do with these strangers. The Tin Man stepped forward and bowed low. Yes, said Ozma. I think we should send them home, the Tin Man said tenderly, wringing his hands, if that's what makes them happy. I would hate to keep them unhappy or angry. But if we made everyone who came here happy, put in the Scarecrow, we would be in a bad way. If we had made Ruggedo happy when he came to conquer Oz, we might all be sticks or animals or something, said the Wogglebug. The Tin Man's eyes assumed a pleading tone. These people have no desire to conquer us. They mean no harm, he said in earnest. In that case, said the Scarecrow, scratching his head, I agree totally with the Tin Man. So do I, said the Wogglebug decidedly. Wiz, said Ozma. I am ready to effect their transportation, he said, showing her his black bag. Ozma looked to Glinda, who, contrary to her usual manner, did not appear to be taking the matter very seriously. A sly smile, as uncommon for Glinda as teeter-totters are uncommon in the Lincoln Memorial, had been growing on her face, and her eyes fairly blazed with fun. She approached the throne with dignity, however, and bowed gracefully. Have you placed a spell on these people? Asked Ozma, leaning forward in her throne. The hall echoed with Glinda's clear, merry burst of laughter. I put no spell on them, but they are enchanted just the same, laughed the Red Queen, with a magic I could never equal. Ozma sat back with a thoughtful look. Dora whispered to Portia, I don't like that laugh. Nonsense, said Glinda, turning to her suddenly. You'll understand it soon enough. She faced Ozma again. Now, Ozma, I leave the riddle to you, but please send them back as soon as possible. Your Majesty, she disappeared in a tuft of red and green smoke that laughed in 1,000 small voices as it faded away into the upper deeps and crannies of Ozma's throne room. Send them back, wizard, commanded Ozma. The wizard began emptying his magic bag of all sorts of magical instruments. They had all been shrunk to magic bag size, and as he took them out, they assumed their full size. As he searched for the correct instrument, the pile grew larger and larger. Finally, he found his magic crayon. He commanded the other things to shrink again and pack themselves away. He threw the crayon toward the floor and pointed out the spot on the floor where he wanted a circle drawn. Big enough for 5, please, he ordered. Then he turned to the travelers. Step over here, please. The group shuffled sullenly into the magic circle. The wizard waved his arm. A sheet of blue silk formed high above. Mrs. Withers cried out and buried her face in Mr. Withers' shirt. The rest closed their eyes. The blue stuff floated gently down over them like a tent, then sank limply to the floor. When they opened their eyes, the cold air was entering the subway, told them that they were speeding beneath the East River. Ozma smiled. Dinner will be served in a half hour. Say no more, said the wizard as he held up his hand. We're off to get ready. The little group of rulers and TikTok filed out the great doors. Ozma turned to Dorothy, who, still seated on the floor, wore a puzzled frown and was scratching her head. The Princess of Oz smiled knowingly at her young friend. You wanted to give them a taste of oblivion water, didn't you, Dorothy? Dorothy looked into space and thrust her arms out in front of her. I don't see why not, she reasoned. They were the first to come here, accident-like, and not like this place. They could have forgot all they knew before and stuck around. They weren't bad folks. I know, Dorothy, but we fairies have to be careful where we wave our magic wands. Everyone has a right to his memories. They're part of his identity. Everyone has a right to be himself unless he wants to hurt someone. Dorothy tucked her knees under her chin and clasped them. You're right, as always, Ozma, she said. And then, I guess I'll go get ready for chow. She rose, walked to the great doors, opened one, and slipped through quietly. In the stately solitude of her throne room, the Queen of Oz laughed merrily at the riddle of the Queen of the South. Chapter 7. In the Merry Old Land of Oz. Dora slipped the paper into the typewriter and rolled it up. She stared blankly at it as she typed. The surf pounded the shore. The daydream was interrupted by the foreman's plumping of a large pile of manuscript into Dora's box. She sat back limply as she passed amid the clatter of the typing pool. Tired of living in the wrong world. Tired of having a dream to exist. Tired. I wish I could escape forever. I wish I were back in Oz. She disappeared. The secretaries in a typing pool don't let little things like strange disappearances bother them. Roy spotted Dora running towards him in the field. He ran in joy to meet her. They sat, and he lifted her high above his head. It was like a commercial, like a dream. Means, muttered Mr. Withers. More of your thoughts on wealth, dear, said his wife, as she walked gracefully into the parlor. You know, means are fine and all that, but you can't dispense with wealth easily. Why not? Because if you want it back, it's not easy. I'm not sure I understand these thoughts. There was a pause. Mr. Withers spoke again. Maybe I've gotten too old. Oh, when we were young, everything was exciting. Even bad things were exciting. Like when we were in Oz. Ah, cooed Mrs. Withers. I wish I were back in Oz. So do I. But eccentric millionaires are always disappearing to some faraway places. Bubba and Portia were silent. The others had left. They leaned against the bare wall, Portia strumming his guitar. He stopped. We're out of it. We have no meaning, he said. He began playing again. Bubba nodded. After a while, he stopped again. We reached the butt end of life. Bubba nodded. Portia played. Then he stopped. He gestured, explaining to the empty facing wall. When people can't do something in the world, they have to get out. People should be free to get out of a world where they don't fit. If they can't, they go crazy. He began talking faster and faster. Bad scene, bad scene. It's fits that make misfits, if you know what I mean. Misfits should be able to get a world where they fit and where they can do something with meaning on it. Bubba nodded and closed his eyes. I wish we were back in Oz, said Portia softly. Bubba did not see him go, only nodded and smiled. Fire Island. Some people never come back from there. The end.